Hi Reddit. Buckle up, this one's a ride. I was 28 when I walked into that office wearing a navy blue blazer I'd ironed 5 times, my resume tucked inside a folder even though I knew they'd already printed a copy. I wasn't nervous exactly. I'd done enough project management in construction-adjacent industries to know how to speak the language. I could read a blueprint, juggle for subcontractors and a passive-aggressive supplier without breaking a sweat. I'd worked with everyone from flooring crews to crane operators, mostly in the Chicago metro area, sometimes up through Milwaukee. It wasn't my first rodeo, but there was a vibe the minute I stepped into that building in Naperville. The receptionist, a woman maybe 10 years older than me, gave me this tight little smile when I told her I was here to interview with operations. She pointed toward the conference room and said, "They're waiting." Like she wanted to add good luck but didn't. The company was called Barrettmore Industrial Supply, a third-generation family-run firm with a reputation for being reliable and a bit behind the times. I'd done my research. Their website still had flash elements. Their logo had a gear in it. They had contracts with about a dozen Midwestern construction firms, mostly highway and municipal projects. The position was Site Logistics Project Manager, which sounded like a mouthful, but the description boiled down to being the person who made sure materials got to where they needed to be on time, without screwing up the schedule or losing half a pallet of rebar on the 88. I'd done that exact job at 2 other places. I wasn't just qualified, I was better than most of the people I'd worked with, period. So when I walked into that interview and saw 3 guys sitting around a table, one of them in a camo baseball cap, one of them in loafers with no socks, and the third looking like a retired gym teacher, I knew what I was in for. Still, I sat down, smiled, shook hands. "Harper Jennings," I said. "Thanks for making the time." They introduced themselves as Walt, cap guy, Kenny, gym teacher, and Greg, no socks. Walt did most of the talking, grilling me on my last 3 jobs. Kenny chimed in every so often with questions that sounded like they were pulled off a 1990s interview worksheet. "Tell me about a time you dealt with a difficult coworker." That sort of thing. Greg just kept watching me, twiddling a pen between his fingers, occasionally looking at a page in front of him like it was written in another language. It was going fine, I thought. They seemed interested. I knew my numbers cold, and when I told them how I cut $30,000 in waste from a concrete supplier contract at my last job, even Greg raised an eyebrow. Walt leaned back, scratched his cheek, looked at the ceiling, and then he dropped it. "Just so you know," he said, in that faux folksy tone guys like him always use before they say something insane, "girls don't usually last long here." Silence. Not even a nervous cough. Just the HVAC system humming and a faint sound of someone wheeling a cart in the hallway. I blinked. Smiled. Not the friendly kind. The "I can't believe you just said that out loud in a job interview" kind. "Good thing I'm not a girl," I said. "I'm your next project manager." Walt laughed like he thought I was kidding. Kenny gave me this look that tried to be sympathetic and ended up more "shouldn't have said that, buddy." Greg looked at his pen and didn't say a word. They wrapped the interview quickly after that. Said they'd be in touch. I walked out into the parking lot and sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, hands on the wheel, heart thudding like I just walked away from a car crash. Then I started the engine and drove to a Dunkin' 2 exits down. By the time I got my iced coffee, my phone buzzed. It was an offer letter from Barrettmore. Full salary, benefits, sign-on bonus. I almost laughed into my straw. They wanted me. After all that, they wanted me. I took the job. Not out of desperation. Not even out of pride. I took it because I wanted to see what the hell kind of place says that to your face and still hires you. I wanted to know what was waiting inside a company that thought "girls don't last long here" was an appropriate warning shot. I wanted to walk into the belly of the beast and figure out how to flip the lights on. Day 1, I walked into the office wearing steel-toed boots and a black polo. I nodded at the receptionist, her name was Candace by the way, and we'd become friends later, and headed straight into orientation. The guy leading it looked like he wanted to ask where the new guy was. When I introduced myself, he blinked. "You're Harper." "That's me." "Didn't expect," he trailed off. I waited. He didn't finish. I smiled and took the packet. The first week was fine. I got the usual new hire stuff. A busted desk chair, a desktop from 2014, a login that took 3 days to activate. My official supervisor was a man named Ed, who referred to himself as old school, but mostly just didn't know how to use Excel filters. Every time I spoke in meetings, there was a half-beat of silence after, like people needed a second to reset. One guy, Chad, I swear I'm not making that up, asked me if I was shadowing someone during my 3rd site visit. I told him no, I was actually running the schedule he was behind on. The expression on his face was priceless. It wasn't outright harassment. Not yet. But there were signs. When I pointed out that a delivery schedule had a major bottleneck, I was told I was overthinking it. When I flagged that 2 vendors were double billing, Ed said they were probably just rounding. When I brought coffee in for the team one morning, someone called it adorable. It was death by 1,000 patronizing cuts. And underneath it all, that sentence from the interview echoed in my head like a dare. Girls don't last long here. You're damn right they don't. Because they're either driven out, worn down, or turned invisible. But I wasn't a girl. I was a goddamn professional. And I was just getting started. By the end of my 2nd month at Barrettmore Industrial Supply, I had learned the exact layout of the land, not by way of any formal onboarding or process training, mind you, but by trial, error, and a whole lot of side-eye from the lifers who acted like the walls had ears and the ears belonged to good OL boys who'd been there since the Reagan administration. The office was a time capsule of middle American mediocrity, and I say that with the authority of someone who's worked in actual warzone-level job sites and managed to maintain her sanity. Here, it was different. It was quiet, yes, but not in a peaceful way. More like the kind of quiet before someone tosses a wrench across the room. The floors were that scratchy beige carpet that never gets vacuumed. The break room smelled like microwave sausage patties in despair. And the only women on staff were me, Candace at the front desk, and Sharon in accounting, who didn't speak to anyone unless it was through a sticky note on your monitor. I quickly figured out the social hierarchy. The upper floor had the so-called leadership, folks like Ed, my manager, who wore dockers that somehow always had a mysterious stain, and other assorted men with names like Chuck, Dennis, and Ron, names that belong on bowling shirts, not org charts. Then there was the warehouse crew, younger guys mostly, who acted normal around me when no one else was around but defaulted to bro mode the moment any of the senior staff appeared. And then there was me, Harper Jennings, official PM, unofficial outsider, professional woman in a space that very clearly was not designed for me to thrive in. The first real sign that I was not going to be treated like a peer came when I submitted my first revised schedule proposal. There was a vendor misalignment that was going to cost us a full week on the Kensington project. And I had a simple fix that involved rearranging 1 delivery and updating 2 procurement points. It was straightforward, it made sense, it was budget neutral. I sent the file to Ed and asked him to take a look before the Thursday logistics meeting. Thursday came. I sat down in the meeting room with my laptop and coffee, ready to walk them through it. Ed walked in 10 minutes late, flipped open his manila folder, and handed out the original outdated schedule. I raised my hand calmly and asked why the revision hadn't been circulated. He gave me a flat look and said, "I figured we'd stick with what worked." I stared at him. Except it didn't work. That's why I revised it. A couple of the other managers chuckled. Not the funny kind. The she's talking back kind. The conversation shifted, and just like that, my work vanished into the void. After the meeting, I approached Ed in the hallway. "If you had an issue with the proposal, I would have appreciated a conversation." He shrugged and said, "Just didn't think it was necessary to complicate things." Could have screamed. Instead I said, "You hired me to manage complexity." He smiled like I was a puppy barking at thunder. "We'll find your rhythm." That became a theme. Anytime I pushed for a change or highlighted an inefficiency, it was brushed aside with phrases like, "That's just how we do things. Don't overthink it," or my personal favorite, "You've got to earn your stripes first." Meanwhile, my male counterpart Russell, hired 2 weeks after me, was allowed to throw together a half-baked vendor rotation and got applauded for his initiative. He'd already been invited to lunch with the executive VP. I got a pat on the back for being feisty. Then there were the little things. I got left off meeting invites. Twice, someone rescheduled a call to a time they knew I was out on site. People would swing by my desk and ask if I could check over this grammar real quick, as though I was their middle school English teacher. A week before Thanksgiving, I got handed a suggestion by one of the sales guys named Darren. He said I should organize a little potluck or something to boost morale. I told him I'd be boosting morale by fixing the logistics backlog they were ignoring. He didn't laugh. But the worst moment, the one that really stuck with me, was when I caught 2 of the warehouse managers standing outside the break room whispering and looking at me. I walked past and one of them, Trevor, whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Won't make it to Christmas." I turned, made direct eye contact and said, "You want to put money on that?" He snorted and walked away. The next day, someone left a post-it on my monitor that said, "Smile more, smiley face," in Sharpie. I didn't report it. I didn't cry in the bathroom. I just peeled it off, stuck it to the underside of my desk and kept working. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. At night, I started keeping a document on my laptop, titled Inventory, as a little joke. Inside it were dates, names, incidents. Every time someone interrupted me mid-sentence, every time I was told to relax, every time my work was presented by someone else like it was their own idea. I had receipts. I wasn't looking to sue anyone, at least not yet. But I knew this was going somewhere. I knew that if I could hold out long enough, I'd find a crack in the armor. Because this wasn't just a case of toxic culture. It was also lazy leadership, brittle egos, and a complete failure to see what was coming. That's when something unexpected happened. I was working late one evening on a fleet distribution analysis when someone knocked lightly on the glass of my cubicle. I looked up and saw a man in his mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, wearing a blue check button-down and no-name badge. He introduced himself as Paul Radley, one of the junior partners in the company's ownership group. He said he'd heard about the updated shipping model I'd built and asked if I could walk him through it. I was stunned. No one outside of ops had acknowledged my reports before. I said yes. He sat down, listened intently for 20 minutes, asked sharp questions, and then said, "This is really damn solid. Why aren't we using this?" I told him to ask Ed. Paul gave me this tight little nod, thanked me, and left. 2 days later, I got a meeting invite from the partner group. No agenda. Just a 15-minute sit-down on a Tuesday morning in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. When I walked in, Paul was there. So was a woman I didn't recognize, tall, sharp-eyed, in a maroon blazer, and a man named Kyle who introduced himself as a financial director. They asked me about workflow bottlenecks, about missed efficiencies, about vendor costs. I answered each one point by point. Afterward, the woman, her name was Lorraine, told me, "We've been watching how things move, and how they don't." I didn't know what that meant at the time, but it stayed with me. So did the look on Paul's face as he glanced down at the printout of my report and said, "There's something here. We just need to figure out how deep it goes." Something was shifting. I could feel it. And for the first time in weeks, I felt less like an outsider and more like a wild card, which, depending on how you look at it, might have been even more dangerous. 3 months into the job and I had started treating every workday like a live exercise in controlled resistance. Showing up precisely on time, logging every microaggression like a forensic accountant, and producing work so airtight it practically laminated itself. I was tired, sure, but I wasn't worn down. Not yet. I was locked in, wired, calculating. The toxic fog hanging over the place hadn't cleared, but I'd learned how to breathe through it. The trick was to stop expecting things to make sense. Once I did that, everything started falling into patterns. Ed, my manager, for instance, had a rhythm to his condescension. He always found a way to joke about women drivers whenever delivery logistics came up like clockwork. Other team leads like Richie from procurement had this way of double-checking anything I submitted, then later referencing my work without credit, like the idea had just floated down from the heavens into their lap. I stopped reacting. Instead, I kept everything, versions of reports, timestamps, even printer logs. I'd started using my phone to record audio notes after meetings just to capture the moments I knew would get rewritten by someone else's narrative later. I didn't share what I was doing. I didn't talk about it with Candace, even though she'd taken to giving me quiet thumbs-ups whenever I walked into the office in the morning like she knew I'd survived another round in the ring. I didn't tell Sharon from accounting, though I noticed she'd started CCing me on emails more often, even when she didn't need to. It was like something silent was building. There was a current I couldn't name but could feel crawling under the floor tiles. Then came the Monroe order. Monroe Infrastructure, one of our biggest accounts, had placed a major materials request for a downtown road expansion, multi-phase, high stakes, lots of moving pieces. The kind of job that made or broke entire quarters for a company like Barrettmore. I noticed within a day that the staging calendar was way off. Someone had logged the wrong dock access days, which meant the main delivery was set to arrive on a day. The site was shut down due to city permit restrictions. I flagged it immediately, adjusted the calendar, and wrote up a proposal to reassign 2 delivery crews and offset the costs by using a warehouse credit from another Monroe job 2 months prior. It was clean, fast, and would have saved us around $12,000. I handed it to Ed on a Thursday morning. He barely looked up. "We'll just run it as is," he mumbled. "I already told them we were good to go." I said, "You told them before verifying the schedule?" He said, "They don't care. As long as the stuff shows up close enough to the target." Close enough. The phrase rattled around in my skull like a loose bolt. I went back to my desk and sent a blind copy of the revised schedule to my personal email. I don't know why. Or maybe I did. 3 days later, Monroe's site manager called in furious. The city had denied their staging request, and the entire delivery had to be rerouted, rescheduled, and partially reloaded at our expense. Emergency overtime was approved. A truck got damaged backing out of an alley it shouldn't have been in to begin with. Ed was called into a partner meeting the next morning. I wasn't invited. That afternoon, Paul Radley showed up at my desk again. Same checkered button-down, same unreadable expression. "You got a second?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't ask about the job screw-up directly. Instead, he asked if I had time to walk him through my version of the Monroe schedule. I opened the file, showed him the original, then my corrected version, then the timestamp proposal I'd submitted to Ed. He asked if I still had the email. I did. He asked if I'd shared the plan with anyone else. I hadn't. He nodded, made a humming sound in his throat and said, "That's what I thought." Then he thanked me and walked out. That evening I stayed late, partly to avoid the passive-aggressive small talk, partly because I felt something tightening around the edges of the office dynamic. The lights overhead buzzed softly. The cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet. Then a message popped into my inbox. Subject: brief meeting tomorrow. From Lorraine Easton. Lorraine was the same sharp-eyed woman from the last time I'd been pulled upstairs, the one who hadn't smiled once during the entire conversation but had taken the time to ask me 3 very specific questions about budget forecasting. Her email was short, just a time, a room number, and a note that Paul and Kyle would be there. No other context. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. It wasn't fear I felt. It was more like preparation. Like the pause before the starter pistol fires. I showed up to the meeting exactly 1 minute early. They were already seated. Lorraine nodded as I entered, motioned for me to sit. Paul looked tired but alert, like he'd been up all night thinking through something complicated. Kyle was tapping something into a spreadsheet but stopped when I walked in. Lorraine spoke first. "We've reviewed the Monroe error and the documentation you submitted. We also pulled the last 2 months of your project proposals, delivery memos, and issue logs." I nodded. She continued. "We've seen enough to know you're not the problem." There it was. Just like that. Paul leaned forward and said, "Let me ask you something, Harper. If you had full control over site logistics tomorrow, scheduling, vendor rotation, resource allocation, what's the first thing you'd change?" I didn't hesitate. Centralize the delivery calendar. Audit vendor relationships. Make schedule changes require documented approval. No more verbal promises made off the record. Kyle looked impressed. Paul smiled just barely. Lorraine said, "We'd like to ask you to join an internal oversight committee. It's informal for now, but we'd bring you in as a direct contributor to a restructuring initiative we're considering." I blinked. "Am I allowed to say yes without knowing what kind of blowback that gets me?" Paul said, "You can say yes and we'll handle the blowback." I said yes. When I walked out of that room, the air in the hallway felt different. Lighter. Sharper. Like static before a storm. I didn't say anything to anyone for the rest of the day, just did my job, took my notes, kept my head down. But later that night, I opened the inventory document on my laptop and added a new entry. March 14th, Monroe schedule rejected by Ed. Later caused $12,000 in losses. Partner review confirmed. Pulled into oversight initiative. That was the night I knew the crack in the wall wasn't just cosmetic. It ran straight through the foundation. And I was already walking through it. After I joined the internal oversight committee, the first thing I noticed was how fast people started watching me without speaking to me, like really watching, in that calculated, quiet way that makes your skin itch even when no one says a word. Suddenly, folks who used to forget I existed were conveniently stepping into elevators with me, lingering outside my cubicle a beat too long, asking how I liked the extra responsibility. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I kept my mouth shut and my ears open. The committee wasn't public. Not yet. Lorraine had stressed discretion, and Paul had backed it up with a subtle warning. "You're going to ruffle feathers just by breathing different in here. So keep your head until we're ready to move." So I kept my head. I took notes during the Friday morning sessions, which were always held offsite at a nearby business incubator under the name Vendor Relations Sync. A cover so thin it barely qualified as plausible, but nobody questioned it. The room usually held 5 of us. Lorraine, Paul, Kyle, a woman from facilities named Anita who said very little but took notes like a courtroom stenographer, and me. Our purpose was quiet at first. Identify friction points in operations, flag underperformers, build a case for restructuring the way logistics, procurement, and scheduling were coordinated. But as the weeks passed and more reports were reviewed, more files quietly pulled, more accounts cross-referenced, something larger began to emerge. Barrettmore wasn't just inefficient, it was calcified. Decisions were made based on memory, habit, and who shouted the loudest. There were no enforced thresholds, no formal accountability, no consequences for missed margins unless it got press attention. The owners had long since stepped back into the shadows, content to let the old regime run things while they collected dividends and played golf at Lakeview Hills. But now the numbers weren't making sense. Contracts were drying up. Monroe wasn't the only client pissed off. And the real kicker? There was money missing. Not stolen. Just unaccounted for. Overruns swept under the rug, write-offs disguised as vendor goodwill, and a phantom supplier that had been paid over $47,000 in 12 months with zero associated deliveries. Kyle had brought that last one to the table, dropping a printed summary on the conference room table like a playing card. Nobody even flinched. It was par for the course. The next week, Lorraine asked me to stay behind after everyone else left. I did. She closed the door and leaned against it like she didn't trust the air outside. "We want to move faster," she said. "We want someone inside operations who understands the terrain and isn't afraid of setting fires when needed." "That's you," I said. "I thought I was already doing that." She shook her head. "Not with authority. We want you to take a stake." I blinked. "A stake?" "Equity," she said. "Buy-in. A minority share. Enough to put you on the board unofficially for now. Enough to make your voice stick." I sat down slowly. "Why me?" Lorraine didn't hesitate. "Because you're smart. You're angry. You have records. And you haven't tried to curry favor with anyone. That makes you dangerous in a way we like." I didn't answer right away. I just sat there with the numbers running through my head. I had some savings, sure, but not the kind of capital that buys stock in an old Midwestern supply company. I said as much. Lorraine smiled faintly and pulled out a folder. Inside were the details: an LLC already drawn up, a founder's buy-in rate that was at a steep discount, and an option for vesting at higher ownership if the company turned a profit in the next 2 fiscal quarters. "We're not asking for millions," she said. "We're asking for partnership." That night I didn't sleep. I stayed up staring at spreadsheets, my personal bank app, and an Excel simulation I built to model risk versus return under 4 different restructuring outcomes. I called my brother in Colorado, who runs his own auto shop, and asked what he thought. He said, "If you're asking me, it's because you already want to do it." He wasn't wrong. By 6 a.m., I had my answer. I walked into Lorraine's office at 8:01 a.m. and handed her a signed copy of the LLC paperwork. She looked at it for a second, nodded, then reached into her drawer and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. "Welcome to the inside," she said. The folder contained an operations keycard with unrestricted access. It also had the minutes from the last partner board meeting, where my name had appeared for the first time as a non-voting participant. The final line item read, "Oversight Advisor H. Jennings, provisionally approved pending equity stake confirmation." Just like that, I was inside the machine. And once I was in, everything accelerated. I began attending partner meetings, not just listening but speaking, presenting findings, submitting reallocation proposals. The response was cautious but respectful. Nobody clapped. Nobody welcomed me with open arms. But they listened. And when they didn't, Lorraine did. Paul did. Kyle did. That was enough. Meanwhile, things on the ground started shifting. Word got out that something was happening upstairs, and suddenly the people who used to ignore me couldn't stop offering to loop me in. Ed, still blissfully unaware of the change, continued behaving like he owned the air around him, but cracks were forming. He looked rattled when Paul started asking detailed questions during ops meetings. He stammered when Lorraine showed up to a budget review. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Ed was called into a closed-door session. He walked in with a folder and walked out with nothing. His desk was cleared by noon. The official reason was retirement. Nobody believed it. I didn't say a word. But when I passed his old office, I noticed the nameplate was already gone. A few weeks later, I got a calendar invite for an executive briefing at headquarters. I wore the same blazer I'd worn to the interview, the one where Walt told me girls don't last long here. And I walked into that boardroom like I'd built it myself. The first thing I noticed was that the seating chart had changed. My name was at the end of the table. Not as a guest. As a partner, I sat down, opened my laptop, and waited. Half an hour later, we finalized the approval for Phase 1 restructuring. Full audit of all vendor contracts, centralized logistics management, and a total revamp of procurement oversight. My voice carried the motion. Paul seconded it. Lorraine smiled with her eyes, not her mouth. It passed. After the meeting, I walked to my car in the drizzle, unlocked it, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. I just stared at the wheel. My hands weren't shaking. My heartbeat was steady. I had done it. I had walked into a system designed to wear me down, twist me up, and shove me out, and I had bought my way into its bones. I'd taken their line, "Girls don't last long here," and turned it into a prophecy they didn't see coming. I didn't just last. I invested. I infiltrated. And now I was co-writing the rules. By the time the first restructuring memos went out, I could feel the temperature in the office drop like someone had turned off the central heating. Figuratively, not literally, though that too happened one morning in February when the maintenance crew forgot to reset the system after a weekend outage, and no one said a word about it until I personally emailed the facility's lead. Everything was colder, quieter, the kind of silence that buzzes with suspicion. People weren't smiling anymore when I passed in the halls, and the usual passive-aggressive comments had either vanished or gone completely underground. I didn't mind. I wasn't there for lunchroom friends. I had a job to do, and now I had the authority to do it. Phase 1 was underway. Vendor audits, project calendar centralization, and mandatory review checkpoints for site scheduling. Old habits didn't die. They screamed, stalled, and tried to sabotage everything on the way out. Half the floor started calling me the auditor behind my back like it was some kind of insult. Jokes on them, I liked the nickname. It meant they were afraid. The real pushback came from a familiar name. Franklin Bress, Regional Director of Supply Chain. Title earned mostly through tenure and loyalty to Barrettmore's ancient leadership. He'd been around so long that people said he had handshakes older than the interns. Franklin had a loud voice, a gold bracelet that clacked against the conference room table whenever he was angry, and a habit of referring to any change he didn't understand as over-engineering. He hated the audits, hated the checkpoints, hated that someone young and unproven was reviewing routing decisions he'd made since before I graduated high school. He never directly confronted me. He wasn't that bold, but I could see the friction building like a thunderhead in his eyes. Then came the Lexington job. Lexington was a multi-million-dollar municipal contract, and the crown jewel of our spring portfolio. If we pulled it off smoothly, the client was ready to sign a 5-year extension that would stabilize 2 regional branches. If we screwed it up, it would go to our competitor Lockridge Supply. No one wanted that. Especially not Franklin, who saw Lexington as his personal legacy project. Too bad he also wanted to run it like a 1980s phone directory. I spotted the issue right away. A routing conflict on inbound delivery for Phase 2 concrete pours. 2 suppliers had been booked for the same delivery window, same day, same dock, same crew. If that went through as scheduled, it would cause a 6-hour bottleneck and delay the pour into overtime, racking up thousands in unnecessary cost. Worse, one of the vendors had a nasty reputation for penalizing cancellations under 36 hours. I flagged it immediately in our new routing software, then followed protocol. I pinged the project ops chat, updated the delivery timeline, and sent a formal correction to Franklin's team. No reply. 2 days passed. I followed up. Still nothing. Then the internal message boards exploded. Lexington Phase 2 was under review due to a scheduling error. Franklin, in a memo addressed to half the company, claimed that recent adjustments introduced by the Oversight Initiative had caused vendor confusion and were directly impacting deliverables. He named no names, but I knew exactly what he was doing. So did Lorraine. An emergency review meeting was called. 11 people in a too-warm boardroom, windows fogged from body heat and tension, and at the center of the table, Franklin with his arms crossed and his bracelet gleaming like a sheriff's badge. He laid out his case. The original schedule had been reviewed, approved, and finalized. Any post-approval edits, he argued, constituted interference. He made a point to use the word unqualified when referring to software-generated alerts. Paul looked at me. "Harper, would you like to speak to the issue?" I did. I pulled up the logs. Vendor A was double-booked. Vendor B had already submitted a scheduling confirmation that conflicted with the site permit window. I showed the timestamp correction I'd submitted on time, using the exact process Franklin himself had signed off on 2 weeks earlier. Then I pulled up the routing software history. Franklin's office had ignored the correction and manually overridden it without comment. Silence. Franklin's face flushed a deep crimson, the kind that spreads from the neck up like someone left the faucet running too long. "We didn't receive the alert," he muttered. "You did," I said calmly. "It was marked red by 2 members of your team, one of whom replied with a thumbs-up emoji." The room cracked, not with laughter, but with the subtle shift of power that happens when a wall finally breaks and the people on the other side realize they've been standing in an open field all along. Lorraine leaned forward. "Franklin, do you still believe this process constitutes interference?" He didn't answer. She asked again. This time his voice wavered. "No," he said. "Not at this time." The meeting adjourned. Nobody looked at me. Not right away. But I knew what had happened. The torch had passed. And Franklin knew it too. He cleared out his office 2 weeks later. Said he was taking time to focus on his health. His health was fine. His ego had been mortally wounded. After that, things moved faster. Phase 2 of the restructuring was greenlit, real-time vendor scoring, a procurement reshuffle, and a consolidation of legacy supplier contracts. I had final review on all routing decisions. All of them. I had a badge with full building access. I had a reserved parking spot with my name painted in block letters. I didn't ask for it. Someone just did it. One night, near the end of April, I stayed late reviewing year-end margin projections. When I walked past the old executive suite, the one that used to belong to Walt from my interview, I saw a janitor wheeling out an empty filing cabinet. I glanced inside. The walls were bare. Desk gone. Shelves empty. That entire wing had been converted into a quiet collaboration space. No nameplates. No shrines to egos past. Just clean tables, whiteboards, and an open calendar pinned to the wall for any team to use. I walked in, stood in the middle of the room, and smiled. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't thrown anything. I hadn't plotted a coup. I had just stayed, watched, documented, and moved, one piece at a time. I hadn't come in swinging. I'd come in listening. And by the time they noticed, it was already too late. They thought they could ignore me. Then they tried to undermine me. Now they couldn't move without my signature. I didn't just survive their system. I rewrote it. I restructured the foundation under their feet and made it look like they'd walked there on purpose. The ones who stayed learned how to work with me. The ones who didn't, well, they left their keys on the table, and I picked them up. The keys sat in my palm like a final punctuation mark, small and quiet and heavy with every insult I never answered, every meeting I wasn't invited to, every note that told me to smile or calm down or stay in my lane. Keys to the executive suite, keys to the supply dock override panel, keys to offices where decisions had once been made without me, around me, in spite of me. Now I held them. No one made a ceremony of it. They were left for me on the corner of my new desk in a plain white envelope labeled Access. No fanfare, no speech, just a subtle nod from Kyle that morning and a passing "looks like you've graduated" from Lorraine, who had the good sense not to smirk when she said it. The office, once a rigid machine powered by stale process and inherited authority, had been rebuilt around necessity, not nostalgia. I wasn't some savior or visionary. I was just the one who stayed long enough to outlast the inertia. We were leaner now. 5 directors were gone. 3 middle managers retired in rapid succession. Their desks cleared overnight like they'd never existed. What replaced them wasn't revolution, it was reason. Procurement ran through a centralized dashboard now, one that required digital sign-off from multiple departments. Site logistics were driven by predictive modeling, not gut feel from guys who'd never touched a spreadsheet. And vendor contracts? Standardized, reviewed quarterly, with real performance metrics that lived in an open access portal. Anyone could check. No more shadow deals. No more phone calls between golf buddies. No more handshakes in place of accountability. And Harper Jennings, the woman they said wouldn't last, was now VP of Operations and Strategic Development, with an office in the northeast corner that looked out over the parking lot and the small, crumbling hill where I used to sit in my car at lunch and wonder what the hell I was still doing here. I had staff now. A team. Not a big one, but smart, efficient, brutally effective. I'd handpicked each of them. Nia from procurement, sharp-eyed, detail-obsessed, fearless with spreadsheets. Chris from warehouse ops, who started as a line manager and now coordinated 6 delivery zones without breaking a sweat. Tanya from internal compliance, who had a memory like a steel trap and the ability to recite company policy with both menace and charm. We had meetings that made sense. We had goals that weren't written in sand. We had a culture that didn't require women to shrink themselves to fit inside it. Of course, not everyone loved it. There were holdouts, people who grumbled behind closed doors about the new regime, about that girl upstairs, about how the place didn't feel the same anymore. They were right. It didn't. And it never would again. Because the old Barrettmore, the one where I was told girls don't last long here, had been quietly dismantled brick by outdated brick, and what remained was a structure built on something they never considered valuable. Competence without ego, power without performance theater, leadership that listened more than it talked. We didn't hang plaques. We didn't do corporate rah-rah speeches. We just delivered results. And for the first time in the company's 72-year history, we hit our quarterly targets 4 quarters in a row. Vendors started pitching us. Clients returned. Staff turnover dropped by half. And the parking lot, once half empty and full of resentment, was alive again. Not bustling but stable. Solid. I kept the keys in my desk drawer. I didn't carry them around like trophies. But I opened that drawer sometimes, late at night, when the building was quiet and the only light came from the soft green glow of exit signs, and I'd rest my fingers on them just to remind myself of how far we'd come, of how close I'd been once to walking away. It still crossed my mind sometimes, how easy it would have been to quit after that interview, to take my iced coffee and drive somewhere else, somewhere safer, where they didn't ask if girls could last. But that wasn't me. It never had been. I wasn't interested in safe. I was interested in structural change, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that walks into a locked room and figures out how to install a new damn door. One day, around mid-September, I came into the office to find that someone, unprompted anonymously, had taped a printout to my door. It was the original job listing I'd applied to, complete with the outdated company logo and the phrase, "Seeking strong leadership to grow logistics oversight." Next to it, someone had scrawled in thick red Sharpie, "Mission accomplished." I took it down and kept it in a folder. I didn't hang it, but I didn't throw it away either. That same day, I passed by the break room and saw a new hire, 22, fresh out of college, eager-eyed and awkward, chatting with Nia about project flow. She had a notebook out. She was asking good questions. She wasn't nervous. That's when I realized the biggest change wasn't just the processes or the structure or the names on the directory. It was the atmosphere. It no longer felt like a gauntlet. It felt like a workplace. And for a moment I let myself breathe. I walked past the window, down the hall, through a door that used to be off-limits to me. I stood in the doorway of what used to be Walt's office, the man who had looked me in the eye and told me girls don't last long here. And I smiled. The room had been converted into a mentorship hub, with 2 desks, a whiteboard, and a poster on the wall that read, "Lead by design, not default." Someone had scribbled a sticky note and stuck it to the door frame. It read, "Harper was here." No name, no initials, just that. I left it there. I didn't need to sign it. The entire building already knew. So no, Reddit, I don't think I'm the asshole. I don't think I was wrong for not quitting, for buying in, for staying when it would have been easier to leave. I didn't burn the place down. I stayed, brick by brick, and rebuilt it around what should have been there all along. I hold the keys now. To the office. To the system. To the door no one thought I'd ever open. And I keep them close, not because I'm afraid of losing them, but because I remember exactly what it took to earn them.